Hey, welcome to Israel Explained. Um, with your host, Ben-Ephraim, of course. So we're standing at a real crossroads right now as far as the war is concerned. As we know, the Israeli government hasn't really excelled in making decisions in this war, especially monumental ones. But right now, we stand at a crossroads. There's a deal brewing, an Egyptian-led deal, which we'll talk about. And on the other hand, Israel is preparing for the first time credibly for the invasion of Rafah. And a lot of people think that one would come at the expense of the other. Uh, I'm not sure that in the long term it would, but in the short term, it's almost certain that an invasion into Rafah would cut off talks. My guess is that after Rafah was taken, Israel would have more of an advantage in talks, but it's unclear, it's a risk. And certainly, every day that passes, there's more danger to the hostages, and possibly more might lose their lives. So there's an impetus to get a deal now in order to save their lives. So Israel is right now at a very serious crossroads. So let's delve into the details here. Egypt has put together a package, which, according to most reports, involves Israel getting 33 humanitarian hostages back. Some reports have fewer, some reports have more in a temporary deal. The number seems to be somewhere between 20, which is more what Hamas wants, 40, which is more what Israel wants, 33 is the number that the Egyptians currently have. The ceasefire would last 1 day per hostage, which is a concession to the Israeli position, because Israel wants 1 day per hostage and not more, and Hamas has wanted more. But there are also concessions towards Hamas. Israel has not yet um, completely committed itself to, but seems to be willing to remove the dividing line between the North and the South, which is stopping internal refugees from the South from moving back north to their homes, but also stopping Hamas from taking over the entire strip. So that would be a big victory for Hamas. In addition, in order to sort of overcome the difference over an end to the war, where Israel wants the war to continue after a deal and Hamas wants it to stop, Israel has agreed to start talks on stopping the war as phase two of the hostage deal. Now, because this deal is relatively favorable to Hamas, and because the attack in Rafah seems to be credibly developing, Israeli negotiators and Egyptian negotiators believe there is an actual chance that Hamas say yes. Um, Hamas has shown some hints that they're willing to settle for less than the end of the war right now because they have enough hostages they can keep in reserve to guarantee that. Still, they won't accept it right away. Hamas has received the offer and said that they're weighing it. A senior Hamas official said today, before they decided, that's important to clarify, that, quote, the Israeli proposal that was presented does not reflect a fundamental change in the Israeli position. It does not give clear answers to the issue of the withdrawal from Gaza and a full ceasefire. According to intelligence reports, it will take Hamas about 48 hours to get the answer back. Knowing Hamas, they might drag it out another day or two. Chances are they'll give a negative answer like they do to everything. However, this is close enough to what Hamas wants that they might give an answer with some horizon to conclude the talks favorably. Now, the deal that was already provided didn't get complete support on the Israeli side, or I should say, there was one very notable voice against it, Netanyahu. Netanyahu insisted, at least at first, that he only wanted a deal freeing all the hostages. But of course, Netanyahu's against a deal freeing all the hostages because that would involve withdrawing from Gaza and ending the war. So Netanyahu's position right now is basically no hostage deal. However, he was outweighed in the cabinet. Gallant, Eisenkot, and Gantz support it, but strengthening their position is that the IDF, Shabak, and Mossad support it as well. In fact, the IDF supports it so much that they are showing deep discontent about Netanyahu's position. And we'll talk about that in a second. One of the things I've been hearing from people who have been participating in these talks is that Netanyahu has been giving one position in the large cabinet and another position in the small cabinet. So, in case you don't know, the small cabinet is the one in where the actual decision making takes place. That's where Gantz is, that's where Gallant is, and that's where they talk about and make the major decisions for the war. The large cabinet includes a lot of showboater politicians who aren't good at making decisions but are good at causing problems. People like Miri Regev, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and Smotrich. In the small cabinet, Netanyahu has been more conciliatory towards the deal. In the large cabinet, Netanyahu has been talking against the deal. By maneuvering between the two in this way, he's delayed offers and has lost the faith of a lot of the decision makers. As a result, the three ministers, Gallant, Gantz, and Eisenkot, have set up a direct line to the Egyptians to talk to them because they don't feel Netanyahu is being an honest broker in this case. Furthermore, sources in the IDF have told me that frustration with Netanyahu has reached fever pitch. They feel he hasn't given them the tools to win the war, and now isn't providing enough backing to the negotiations to get the hostages released. They believe his cabinet is paralyzing him, and that's why he's acting this way. And indeed, there's reason to believe that. Ben Gvir is currently in the hospital for his accident involving reckless driving, but Bezalel Smotrich, said he will quit the government if the deal goes through. He called it, quote, a horrific surrender to the Nazi enemy, end quote. And if Smotrich says he's going to go, Ben Gvir is going to have to say he needs to go because Ben Gvir has to outmaneuver Smotrich to the right at all times. The IDF feels that it's time to get the hostages out since there's no real plan to defeat Hamas and that they can renew fighting at any time. Of course, to be fair to Netanyahu, the IDF isn't fully abreast of all the diplomatic problems with renewing the fighting after a ceasefire, and we'll talk a little bit about what those problems are towards the end of this video. And to put pressure on Israel to not so much accept the hostage deal because Hamas hasn't accepted it, but rather to keep negotiating a hostage deal, they've released two videos with signs of life from hostages. We already remember the one with Hirsch a few days ago. Today they released a video with the signs of life from two more hostages, Keith Siegel, 64, and Omri Miran, 46. Now I've watched the videos, and by the way, feel free to watch the videos because in this case, the family hasn't tried to say that you shouldn't watch them. They're all for it. The two mention that it's been 202 days since the war started, and they also talk about missing their family in the Passover holiday. All that would suggest that these are very recent videos, and I believe they are. The two, of course, asked to be returned in a hostage deal, as Hamas has asked. If you watch the videos, it's very clear that Hamas divides it, cleverly, I should say, between propaganda, where they're told what to say, and a sort of heartfelt appeal to their families, which appears to be unscripted. The two together create a very devastating impression, which has had the effect that they wanted it to have on Israeli public opinion and on the families. Representatives for the families put out the following statement. They charged that the military pressure, which the government had said would bring their loved ones home, has failed. The state of Israel must choose hostages or war. Entering Rafah will bring more murdered hostages in captivity, or their deaths in the war. Entering Rafah will be another way for the abductees to die. Israel must choose to return the hostages. End quote. So that's a ton of pressure on Israel internally to agree to that deal, coming from the IDF, coming from the families, and coming generally from public opinion. I haven't seen any good polling on this, but my guess is that if there was a deal right now to return the hostages, the vast majority of Israelis would agree to it. Certainly if it didn't involve an absolute end to the war, possibly even if it did. That's definitely a survey worth doing at this point. So that's one option, the hostage deal. I'm skeptical that Hamas will agree, although it's not impossible if Israel makes enough concessions. The other option is an operation in Rafah. Operationally speaking, Israel is finally preparing for that properly, setting up tents, sending armored assets near Rafah, and Hamas has gotten the message. That's why they're releasing all these videos. They're nervous. But that faces complications on the diplomatic level, on several levels. First, the good news for Israel. It seems that they've more or less worked out with Egypt that they can go into Rafah. We'll talk about the United States in a moment. That's more complicated. But perhaps the most important complication now is a new actor, the ICC. Now, we've all talked about the ICJ, that's the International Court of Justice, where there's that lawsuit accusing Israel of committing genocide. The ICC is a separate, though related, court, the International Criminal Court, which, unlike the ICJ, which releases rulings regarding states, the ICC tries and convicts individuals. So far, the ICC has not gotten involved in this war, but as it's dragged on, there's been pressure on it, and it has made moves to involve itself as well. Since mid April, so last 10 days or so, there have been increasing reports that they're on the verge of issuing warrants to arrest senior Israeli officials. Best case scenario, that would involve IDF generals. Worst case scenario, that would involve the highest levels of government, including Netanyahu. The ICC issued warrants for two Russian generals involved in the Ukraine war, so it has a precedent for the IDF. If it goes as far as to bring in Netanyahu himself, which some reports are saying, that would be a new escalation. It would, of course, be incredibly controversial. The Israeli Foreign Ministry is working to try to talk to the ICC, to talk to the United States and other countries to try to prevent this. It's not clear how much leverage Israel has or any of these other countries have on the ICC, but it's certainly worth a try. According to some reports that I've seen, Netanyahu is obsessed with this issue, and it's currently serving as a major deterrent towards him going into Rafah. He feels like this can be avoided or lessened if he doesn't go into Rafah. Now, as for the United States, there's no clear picture emerging about their attitude towards this operation. We've been seeing that the United States has given a green light to the Israeli moves to evacuate Rafah. They think that the plan that Israel currently has is not a bad one. And I've also heard reports that they're willing to live with an Israeli invasion of Rafah too, especially one that's focused on the Philadelphia route. But Thomas Friedman, who is sort of a mouthpiece for the Biden administration, released a piece in the New York Times today that says otherwise. The piece is titled Rafah or Riyadh, creating a distinct choice that Netanyahu has between going to normalization with Saudi Arabia and going into Rafah. Perhaps the most important line in there is when he said that a U.S. official said the U.S. is considering restricting some arms sales if Israel goes into Rafah. That's worth looking at. I don't believe it. I mean, I believe that this official said that. I don't believe the U.S. would actually do that, especially if Israel cleared out enough of the refugees properly. But that's certainly something that's weighing on Netanyahu's mind as well. So there's risks involved and serious problems with both options, Rafah option or hostage deal option. But we're getting to the point where a choice must be made between the two of them. Honestly, a choice probably should have been made between the two of them months ago, but here we are. The clock is, however, running out, or arguably has already run out, for the diplomatic support for an operation in Rafah. The ICC is a serious problem. If Israel finds itself fighting off the ICC and the ICJ for the next 5 years, that will be an unbelievable blow to the Israeli legitimacy, and I'm not even sure that can be avoided at this point. The United States and Egypt appear to be obstacles that can be overcome more. But time is running out for the hostages. They may not be alive for very much longer. Netanyahu has to make a decision between the two. His lack of decision has led us to the point where most of the hostages, or a good number of them, are dead. Hamas seems to still be in power. Israel is increasing in its isolation. If he doesn't make a decision, all the hostages will be dead. Hamas will have all of Gaza, and Israel will suffer isolation like it's never known before. He needs to choose one of those paths and go all the way with it. You know what my choice is. I don't think these negotiations are going anywhere. I don't think that Hamas will give up the hostages for anything rather than an Israeli surrender. An Israeli surrender is catastrophic for it in the long term. Therefore, Israel should go in, create a new Palestinian government, normalize with Saudi Arabia, move towards a Palestinian state, use that diplomatic momentum to try to lift the isolation that its enemies are trying to inflict on it. It has a lot of risks, but it beats the alternative. But a full hostage deal would beat not making a decision. A full hostage deal would beat just letting this war drag on and suffering the worst of all possible worlds. All the hostages dying, Israel being completely isolated, Hamas remaining in Gaza. Okay, a lot of questions from you guys, even though I did that other video very recently. Thank you so much for this. JDB316 asks, how does settling for weakening Hamas versus completely removing it from Gaza help Netanyahu politically? Wouldn't that be seen as a defeat for him? Yes, it would be seen as a defeat for him, and that's why what I was talking about in the last video, maybe I wasn't clear enough, wasn't so much that Israel has made a strategic decision to weaken Hamas and surround it, as much as because it's not willing to make any other decision, as in go in and knock Hamas out and replace them. Um, or make some kind of deal, some kind of international deal, that will be the de facto choice. So what Netanyahu is doing is he's settling for that, but he's not announcing that he's settling for that and postponing the fallout from that as much as possible. That's basically the only way to understand what Netanyahu is doing nowadays, is he's just kicking the can down the road as much as possible. And the end result of that will be terrible. So yes, it will be seen as a defeat for him, but he wants to postpone the full recognition that that's a defeat as much as possible. Drop Off asks, where the hell is Sinwar? How has Israel devoted so many resources and so much time to finding him, only for him to continue surviving? That's a great question. We actually know where Sinwar is because Sinwar lately has been making public appearances. That's something that Israel doesn't really want you to know, but it's true. He's been popping up in Rafah and visiting, the troops and the market and all kinds of things like that in unexpected times and surviving. I don't know how many times he's done it, but he's done it at least twice, from what I've heard. When he's in the bunker, he's surrounded by Israeli hostages. So the IDF, even when it knows where he is, can't really take him out. And Israel suffered a terrible defeat in terms of perception by talking so much about how they're about to get Sinwar and not getting him, something that I talked about at the time and was a terrible mistake. It's a catastrophe. It's an absolute catastrophe. Sinwar's alive, well, and running the entire Gaza Strip, despite what Israel wants people to think. SNSC7KW asks, does the survival of Hamas provide Israel with the legitimacy to refuse a two-state solution in perpetuity? Yes, and that's the reason Hamas has been allowed to exist for so long. It's also because taking them out would be very difficult. That's one element, but another element has always been, as long as Hamas is in charge of Gaza, you can always say there can't be a two-state solution because look at these nut jobs, look at these terrorists. How can we make a deal with them? Meanwhile, the PA wants to talk, but you can say, well, the PA doesn't control everything, so we don't need to talk to them. It allows Israel to not make decisions. There's a uh, common thread here leading to disaster. Israel not willing to make decisions because of political reasons and that leading to disaster. By the way, we saw something very similar in the 1970s with Golda Meir and Rabin when Israel allowed settlements to be built because it didn't want to confront the political ramifications of stopping that, creating a lot of the problems that we have now. And a long question from longtime follower of the show, although I have no idea what his name is because, or her name is, because it's letters and numbers, FRDZ4KB, a critic of the Netanyahu government. Is there any argument that the war is not going as disastrously as critics have said it would? Hamas is politically more potent than before. Hostages could have been rescued via a deal early and have died. The Israeli political standing is very precarious. The ICC investigations into war crimes will keep Israel's diplomatic services busy for a decade or more. The international push to recognize a Palestinian state has more steam than in 2 decades. The only surprisingly positive thing is that the IDF took far fewer losses than anticipated, probably at the cost of Palestinian civilians, which means that even that vivacious tactical victory is at the expense of strategic defeat. What exactly can Israel realistically hope to achieve now? Nothing. Hamas will stay and rearm unless a political settlement reduces their credibility. Well, Yeah, I generally agree with you. Yeah, and this has always been something with your comments. They're always like a shade more pessimistic than mine, but I generally agree with you. This war has gone very badly. Um, I would say the IDF has performed very well, has dismantled the vast majority of Hamas's force. I don't think that it's killed as many civilians as Hamas is claiming. I think that considering the conditions, it's actually done quite well in that regard. I know that's a controversial statement. So I don't think there's really that much of a problem with the way the IDF has conducted the war on the strategic level. Obviously, there's a problem with discipline, but in terms of their achievements, the problem is that the Israeli government doesn't have clear goals, achievable goals for this war. And when there's no match between the tactical things that you're doing and the strategy that you're trying to achieve, things go off the rails. And that's what's happened now. Is there any way to achieve anything out of this? Yes. So, worst case scenario, if Israel remains in this position and the war ends, it is quite possible that Israel will have restored its deterrence to quite a greater extent than we expect. We saw that in the Second Lebanon War when Hezbollah was deterred from fighting Israel for a very long time. It's possible that Israel has weakened Hamas also on a political level in Gaza, although that is probably optimistic. Um, the best case scenario is Israel removes its government, changes it to another government, starts moving with the United States towards Saudi normalization, towards a Palestinian state, and towards the removal of Hamas. I'm not saying these things are likely, but these things are possible. Generally speaking, I agree with your very pessimistic assessment. GGA asks or says, disappointing news. If, worst case scenario, a weakened but vengeful Hamas survives, what does their strategic outlook look like? Does Sinwar emerge as the unquestioned tyrant, having gotten the ceasefire he hoped for? Or does the lack of a regional war against Israel and the obliterated continuation of Gaza neutralize his true ambitions and ability to protect power outside the strip? Ooh, that's a good one. And I don't really have an answer to that. You sort of outlined the two possibilities. It can go either way. My guess is that while Sinwar himself will probably be killed at some point, I don't know if Sinwar himself will reap the benefits of this. I think it's hard to imagine Sinwar coming out, ruling Gaza, and Israel letting him live. But Hamas as an organization will more likely reap benefits from this than penalties from this. I think that that's one of the reasons we're seeing the PA try to get an approval of a Palestinian state because they're trying to get some achievement to compete with Sinwar, but Israel and the United States are not letting them have that. So what's going to happen? Hamas will have defeated Israel. They'll become unquestionably the strongest party in with the Palestinians. They'll have all the power in the West Bank. Only Israel will stop them from taking over. They'll be heroes to the Arab and Muslim world, not to mention an increasingly large amount of people in the West. I think this strengthens Hamas unless Israel is able to replace them in the Gaza Strip, unfortunately. Okay, that's it for today. If you like what I'm doing here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. I'm working on a podcast right now on the attitude of the Israelites to monarchy in the Bible. So look out for that episode of the History of the Land of Israel podcast coming soon. And I will see you here next time something interesting happens, which I'm sure will be soon.